Right, we got David Suzuki with his Christmas message for 2017.
Will be gone within decades in this century. My response to all of that is, why are you saying that it's too late? There's no point. Surely we're going to struggle and fight right to the end. Yes, it's urgent, and that's the message I get. But to say, no, it's too late, that's ridiculous. That's simply too soul destroying to hear that. But I think that the urgency is what we have to listen to. We have very little time to act. So I would suggest in your country and mine, do not offer your vote to a single candidate at any level of government unless they declare that climate change is an issue that they will devote a great deal of their lives to. And it mustn't be a political football. It's not just the Green Party that will say this. We must demand it of every candidate for political office. The signs are depressing, it's true, but I cling to hope. And that hope is based on more than just a Pollyanna-ish idea. Oh, don't worry, good things will happen. My hope is based on the faith, one that love, and please don't think I've suddenly become a dippy hippie. I believe that love is the driving force of our species. And it is love of our children and grandchildren that must override all of the economic, political, and social pressures. But more than that, we don't know enough to say it's too late. And let me give you an example of why I say that. The most prized species of salmon in the world is called the sockeye salmon. It's the salmon with the bright red flesh and lots of fat in it. It tastes great, especially when it's raw. Sockeye salmon are the biggest run in the world is in British Columbia in the Fraser River. And ever since pre-contact levels of sockeye salmon, the runs were between 100 and 120 million fish each year. But after contact, when we dammed rivers and had landslides that blocked the Fraser, we got a catastrophic decline. But the Fraser River in British Columbia has the largest sockeye run in the world, and we like to get 30 to 35 million animals coming back. In 2009, we barely got a million sockeye returning to the Fraser. And I remember looking at Tara, my wife, and saying, that's it. There just isn't the biomass to get them to their spawning grounds. They're toast, they're gone. 1 year later, in 2010, we got the biggest run of sockeye salmon in 100 years. I use that story not to show how stupid I am. Nobody knows what the hell happened. But nature shocked us with surprise. And I believe nature has got a lot more surprises up her sleeve. We just have to pull back and give her room. And she will be far more generous than we deserve. That's my hope. I was in the United States. I studied there for 8 years, getting an education in the 1950s that we couldn't get in Canada at that time. And I was starting the last year in college in Massachusetts in 1957. And on October 4th, the Soviet Union shocked the world by announcing they had launched Sputnik. And that was really a frightening time. The Soviet Union was a very powerful force at that time, and every hour and a half we could hear the beep, beep of Sputnik thumbing its nose at us. The Americans immediately tried to launch their own satellites, and everyone blew up in the launch pad. Meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal in space, a dog, Laika, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, the first team of cosmonauts, the first spacewalk, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. Americans didn't flinch. They didn't say, oh my God, they're so far ahead, we can't afford to catch up. They said, we got to catch these guys. And it was a glorious time. You know, here I was, a Canadian living in the States. All you had to do was say, I like science. And they threw money at us. It was glorious. And in 1961, President Kennedy announced that Americans would get humans to the moon and back within a decade. When he announced his plan, he didn't have a clue how the hell he was going to do it. He just knew that they had to get to the moon and beat the Russians. And look what happened. Not only are they the only country to land people on the moon and get them back, but all of the unexpected benefits that have come out of making that commitment. Even today, 60 years later, when Nobel Prizes are announced, believe me, Americans cop a huge number of those science Nobel Prizes. Why? Because in 1958, Americans said, we got to beat the Russians in the space program. Every year, NASA publishes a magazine called Spin-Off. Hundreds of unanticipated spin-offs that have come out of the space program, from laptop computers to GPS to cell phones to space blankets and ear thermometers. Hundreds of these things have come simply by seizing the moment and the challenge and saying, we've got to beat it. And I believe that's the moment we're at here. Climate change represents the ultimate crisis for our species that becomes a huge opportunity if we seize the moment and commit ourselves to beating it. I returned to Canada in 1962, and I had studied for 8 years in the States. I was a hotshot geneticist. I was going to make my name as a big scientist, and I got completely sidetracked by a woman. Not she's too young for that, but this has happened all through my life, usually with disastrous consequences. But in this case, I've been ever grateful to her. And the great regret I have is that I never met her. But in 1962, a woman named Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring, and it changed my life. We have to remember in 1962, there wasn't a Department of the Environment in any government on Earth. The word environment didn't mean in 1962 what it has come to mean today. The discovery that DDT kills insects by Paul Miller won a Nobel Prize for him in 1947. We thought DDT pesticides were fantastic until Rachel Carson's book came out. And for me as a scientist, what stunned me was the realization that science can be very powerful, but we don't know enough to anticipate all of the unknown things in nature that we can't expect to be affected. When DDT began to be used on a wide scale, it was only when eagles in the United States began to disappear that scientists tracked it down and discovered a phenomenon called biomagnification. Up the food chain, you concentrate DDT hundreds of thousands of times until you get to the shell glands of birds or the breasts of women. How could we have managed DDT properly when we only discovered biomagnification after eagles began to disappear? And that's happened over and over again. When CFCs began to be used on a wide scale, we had no idea. High up in the atmosphere, ultraviolet light would break chlorine-free radicals off CFC that would scavenge ozone. When nuclear bombs were dropped over Japan, we didn't know there was a phenomenon called radioactive fallout. And now we have such conceit. We want to genetically engineer plants and animals for our use. We want to indeed engineer the planet with geoengineering to deal with the issue of climate change. I believe it's a form of madness to have the hubris to think that we're capable of doing that. For me, again, as a scientist, the most profound message I got from Silent Spring was that in nature, everything is connected to everything else. And I realized scientists look at things in bits and pieces, all on the assumption if we look at enough bits and pieces, we'll fit them back together to get a picture of the whole system. But we spray on chemicals on farmers' fields to kill insects and end up discovering that fish and birds and human beings are affected. Everything is connected, and we can't determine all of those interconnections through science. I just want to tell you a story that one of the programs that the David Suzuki Foundation undertook that I'm so proud about was to try to illustrate this issue of interconnectivity. One of the rarest ecosystems on the planet is called the temperate rainforest. And in North America, we have the largest temperate rainforest extending from Alaska down to the northern part of California. And it's that thin band pinched between the Pacific Ocean and the coastal mountain range. And it has the highest biomass the weight of living things of any ecosystem on Earth. And the reason for that is we've got big trees. But the dilemma for scientists was, how can we have such big trees when the soil is nitrogen deficient? It rains a lot. That's why it's a rainforest. That rain washes nutrients, but especially nitrogen, out of the soil. So it was a real paradox for us. You've got these big trees, and you've got not enough nitrogen in the soil to raise them. And it turned out the solution was the salmon. You see, the salmon are born in thousands of rivers and creeks, all up and down through the temperate rainforest. And they're born in fresh water. They go out to sea. There are 5 species of salmon that live, depending on the species, 2 to 5 years at sea, and then they come back to spawn in the original rivers or waters where they were born. Now, it turns out that almost all of the nitrogen you find on land is the normal isotope of nitrogen called nitrogen 14. But in the oceans, there's a very large proportion, well, small, but still a very significant proportion of the nitrogen in the oceans is nitrogen 15. It's a slightly heavier atom isotope that we can detect the difference between N15 and N14. So the salmon go to sea for 2 to 5 years. They load up in nitrogen 15, and then they return to their spawning rivers and creeks by the tens of millions up and down the coast. So they're loaded with nitrogen now, and everyone celebrates. If you've ever gone to a spawning experience on the coast, you know the birds and the seals and the whales, everybody is making noise because now this mass of creatures is coming back. And they get to the river, and the major predators of the salmon are eagles, bears, and wolves. So they'll eat the salmon as they're coming up to spawn, and then, of course, they poop and pee nitrogen 15 loaded urine and feces throughout the forest. So they're literally fertilizing the forest. Now, the bears are normally solitary animals, but during the salmon season, they'll fish in the same pool with literally dozens of others. But when they grab a salmon, they take off into the forest up to 150 meters on either side of the river because they want to eat it by themselves. I mean, I understand that. They want to eat the best parts, which, as you all know, are the brains, the belly, and the eggs. And then they'll dump the carcasses, lots more. They go back for another one. On average, a bear will take about 600 salmon in a season. So they're spreading the carcasses again through the forest. The carcasses left are eaten by ravens and salamanders and slugs. But the major exploiters of the carcass are flies. So flies lay their eggs. Within a few days, that carcass is a seething mass of maggots loading up with nitrogen 15 from the salmon, dropped to the forest floor. Over winter and in the spring, flies hatch by the trillions at the very time the birds from South America are coming through on their way to their nesting grounds in the Arctic. So you see, those birds have been genetically programmed to come through at the very time those salmon, through the flies, are feeding them on their way to the Arctic. If the salmon are not taken out of the river and sink to the bottom, within a week or so, they're covered with a thick mat of fungus and bacteria, and the fungus and bacteria are eaten by copepods and insects and other invertebrates. So when the baby salmon emerge from the gravel 4 months later, the rivers are filled with nitrogen 15 containing invertebrates so that the salmon can feast on their way down to the ocean. So in dying, the salmon prepare a feast for their offspring. And then what we funded was scientists to go in and actually take the cores of trees in salmon-bearing areas and non-salmon-bearing areas. And we showed that when you pull out the core and look at the fat rings, they're loaded with nitrogen 15. And the skinny rings, when they're hardly grown, you find very little nitrogen 15. So the salmon are literally feeding the forest with their carcasses. So it's a magnificent story of the interconnection of the north and southern hemisphere and the oceans and land and the air. Now, modern humans come along. Oh, those indigenous people, they don't know anything. We're going to manage these resources. And so we say, well, we've got all these salmon there. That's the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans for the commercial fishery. But then there are all those indigenous people. That's the Ministry of Indian Affairs. What about the sports fishermen? Well, that's the Department of Tourism. So we
Okay, there we are on the upload limit. Back soon as I can.